This is Jennifer Havey and our fantastic Love and Responsibility team bringing you another talk inspired by St. John Paul II. The mission of Love and Responsibility LA is to help form hearts and minds to love authentically, inspired by these teachings. Tonight, we have Bishop David O'Connell here in the San Gabriel region to begin this session by giving us a blessing to open our hearts and minds to hear from the Lord. Thank you for joining us again, Bishop David. There he is.
Unmuted? Okay.
Got it.
Jennifer's getting used to muting me and she likes doing it.
No.
I'm under a gag order. But anyway, everybody, welcome. It's so wonderful to see all of you. Thank you for joining us. And thank you for being open to letting Jesus guide you and love you. And thank you for being open to letting God, our Father, show you his dream for your life, because he has a dream for your life. And of course, I don't know if there's anybody else Irish here on the Zoom call, but Irish people are not good, especially men, Irish men, to talk about love and marriage and everything, because Irish men are noted for being absolutely not romantic in any way whatsoever. For instance, there's a story about the Irishman and his new wife going on a honeymoon. And on the way to the honeymoon, on the way into the hotel, the new wife said to her husband, "I'm embarrassed that people would know we're newly married. Let's pretend like we're married 9 or 10 years. He said, "Okay, then you carry the suitcases." That's a joke, by the way. That's a joke, sorry. And then, of course, somebody said, if you ever see an Irishman opening the car door for his wife, he's either just got a new wife or he's just got a new car. Now, one more story. A couple of years ago, I was outside a church in Ireland and I saw a woman with a beautiful diamond ring. I said, "That's a beautiful diamond ring." And she said, "Yes, that's a famous diamond. That's the Murphy diamond." She said, "Of course, you know, Bishop, that with every famous diamond, there's a curse." I said, "I didn't know that." She says, I said, "What's the curse that goes with the Murphy diamond?" She said, "Mr. Murphy." Okay. Okay, Jennifer said that's all the jokes I'm allowed. So but, I want to just take 1 minute, and I know you have a beautiful evening planned of Timmerie is going to give us a beautiful talk, but I was just reflecting on the gospel for next Sunday in Matthew 10, where Jesus said, "Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever loves brother or sister more than me is not worthy of me." It seems like a very difficult thing that Jesus is saying there, but what the teaching of Matthew is telling us is, no matter what relationships you have in your life, or no matter how well they're going or how badly they're going, put Jesus first. Put Jesus first. Let him be the first in your heart. And then all the other relationships will come right. Day by day, week by week, bit by bit, they will become beautiful. And so as we begin our time this evening, just let's think about that for a few moments. And let's each one of us, and I know I'm very grateful to all of you for seeking ways to bring Jesus into your relationships, into your marriage, into your life, and especially, and because this will be wonderful for you, but it's also a great gift to your families and to the world in which we live. Because there's hardly no relationships where they're bringing Jesus and putting him first in their lives. And this is why there's so much suffering now in relationships, where there should be joy and love and excitement and passion and all those beautiful things that God wants to give you, but put Jesus first. So as we begin, Lord Jesus, we renew our love for you, Lord Jesus. We place our lives before you. We love you. We open our hearts to you. Jesus, I love you. Come into my life today. Guide me, be with me. Come into my heart. I receive you again as my only Lord and Savior. I put my life under your authority. I put my marriage, my family, all my relationships under your authority. Just speak to Jesus like this each day, each morning, each night, and even do that together. And you will see that when you put Jesus first and renew in your heart your love for him and speak to him with love and walk with him on the journey of life with love, that you will begin to see happening God's wonderful plan for your life and for all your relationships. And may the Lord be with you, and may Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
God bless you, my beautiful brothers and sisters.
Thank you, Bishop. Thank you so much for being such a great shepherd too, laying down your life for your flock. Thank you.
God bless.
All right, so just as a reminder for everyone, before we begin, there is a Q&A button where participants can type in their questions. And after the 45-minute talk, we will have a question and answer time like every time. Usually there's about 50 to 60 questions, so we can't get to all of them, but we're hoping to have another session that will just be Q&A. So please put your questions in. Also, all the recordings are available on our Facebook page, which is at Love and Responsibility LA, and you can watch any parts that you missed. I had to go back and watch Father Matthias's talk because it was so deep and rich. And we heard him talk about holy and happy in marriage and sex last week. And tonight, our dear friend Timmerie will speak on the topic of freedom in respect to the female and male dimension. So without further ado, I want to introduce Timmerie Geagea. So Timmerie is the host of the radio show podcast Trending with Timmerie, heard on Relevant Radio, and is a Catholic speaker educating in areas of theology and is an expert at responding to current trends of sexuality, feminism, and gender ideology. Prior to this, Timmerie worked for 5 years as the Director of Education and Outreach at Life Choices Pregnancy Counseling Center in San Diego. She holds a master's degree in biblical theology and a bachelor's degree in communications media with an emphasis in the new evangelization from John Paul the Great Catholic University. Her diverse professional background includes public relations, consulting for nonprofits at a national level. Thanks for joining us, Timmerie.
It's great to be with you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you are. Yep, we hear you fantastic.
Excellent. Well, after such a great introduction and a fabulous prayer from What a Gift to have Bishop O'Connell with us, let's dive in.
All right, go for it.
I'd like to thank each of you for being here. I know many of you have probably been tired of either online Zoom conferences for work or for school. I feel like we've been living in a digital world for months now and we're already so engaged with our technology. So today's talk I'm really excited about because Jen, this has been a passion project of hers for a number of months now, and we've had many opportunities to sit down and discuss this series. And the unique element that I wanted to discuss is understanding St. John Paul the Great, as Carol Wojtyla before becoming Pope, his discussion on love and responsibility in relation to freedom, happiness, in the male and female dimension. And so I lay that out because ultimately, when we're searching for love, sometimes in all the wrong places, we're ultimately orienting ourselves toward happiness. It's a search for happiness. But one of the challenges in our culture is that there's this rejection by the gender ideology movement, by our own understanding of ourselves or lack of understanding of ourselves, of the male and female component that are so important in this conversation. So I want as kind of the focus of our talk to start with this quote from JP2, Carol Wojtyla, same person. Our church changes names, it has a habit of that. St. Peter, Sarah, Abraham, I could go on and on. But we'll start here with this quote from Love and Responsibility. And I think that there's a lot to be unpacked in it today. It reads, "A woman wants to love so that she can show love, versus a man wants to love so he can be loved." We'll be discussing shame in relation to this conversation later on in a culture that doesn't really like the idea of shame. And I think it's because we've confused what exactly it is. So let's go ahead and start with happiness. What's the secret to a happy life? I think this is something that each of us are striving for and we're hungry for. And maybe we read those quick tips of 3 things to help you have a better, happier life. But I really have to say, in Love and Responsibility, we're unpacking and not just scratching the surface, but going very deep in this series as to what it means to find happiness with regard to human love and how does that relate to our human nature. And so I want to dive for just a moment into an introduction to Aristotle, who's someone that our dearly beloved Saint John Paul the Great loved. And Aristotle, who he would have studied very much, talked about how happiness is ultimately living well and acting well. You see, happiness has to do with living a life of action. We're action-oriented creatures. And this isn't just exterior actions, but it's the actions we take in relation to our thoughts in that interior dialogue that we have going on a day-to-day basis. But in order to accomplish this happy living, we have to have a target that we're aiming at. Now, as Catholics, we know that ultimately our target would be heaven. But in order to kind of understand that target and the steps it takes to get there, it's important, and Aristotle understands this, that we understand things such as what is good, what is virtuous. In fact, I think of how we're ultimately oriented, what Aristotle talks about, to what is good. And how St. John Paul the Great in Love and Responsibility really directs us towards seeking after the good of another human being. But that's challenging in our modern culture. We're so content with this idea that my happiness is contingent upon what I receive. It's ultimately, we're living so often and unknowingly in this passive happiness. Whatever comes my way, whatever I experience, that's what brings happiness. It's not about how I participate necessarily in the world. A great example of this is sometimes the resentment that enters into our lives, where we start to hear conversations where people say, well, my life would have been different had I gotten this job, had I not been cheated out of this money, had my upbringing been a little different. And we continuously talk about all these external realities. And ultimately what we're saying is happiness is contingent upon what's passive, what I just receive. Where in reality, Aristotle is challenging us to actually participate in our happiness, to live well and act well. I think about how it's so easy to live on that experiential level of whatever comes our way, but that's kind of comfortable. It's comfortable to sit and kind of scroll social media. It's comfortable to not speak up when difficult cultural, moral, and religious issues come up. But I think of a great quote that always stands out to me, and I quote and think of all the time. And that is Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, some years ago, said that the world offers us comfort, but we weren't made for comfort. We were made for greatness. And I would argue that this greatness that he discusses requires you and I to go outside of ourselves. And ultimately, this is what Love and Responsibility is directed toward. And so this whole series and conversation has been about your happiness and well-being, living well and acting well, to freely make these decisions. So let's talk about something that our beloved Carol Wojtyla said here. He said, men and women desire love in anticipation of the happiness which it can bring into their lives. So ultimately, we're seeking out relationships, friendships, familial friendships, and ultimately romantic relationships because we perceive it as something that's going to make us happy. Now, that means this all requires freedom, the freedom to pursue these things and relationships and people in our lives. But what we need to do is we need to understand what GP2 lays out is that in order to do this with regard to friendship, that means we need to long for true happiness for another person, that we must have a sincere devotion to that other person's good, and that this ultimately is what puts the priceless imprint of altruism on love. Being rather than self-centered and passive and just receptive to the world and kind of saying, woe is me if everything doesn't go my way. It takes us outside of ourselves to see another person. But I mentioned a second ago that this ultimately requires freedom. Now, freedom from a distinct perspective of the human person is something we have to understand is fundamental to being Catholic. We often hear conversation in the church. I remember being involved in the pro-life movement for about 10 years ago, and we'd often hear language about the dignity of the human person that pro-life people would use as terminology to refer to the unborn child, and how this child has inherent dignity. But I think that word dignity is kind of a term that we don't often understand, yet it's something that the church so highly upholds. And then in the last probably 8 years, we've seen secular culture now talks about the dignity of the person. And I think it's a neat transition because it's something that pro-life individuals have been saying all along. But what gives that dignity, that value to the person? What's necessary for loving relationships? Well, we know that God created us first in his image and likeness. So if God created us in his image and likeness, what does this mean? How does it set us apart from the rest of creation? You see, reading Genesis chapters 1 and 2 and even 3, understanding our creation, and in fact, Genesis tells a story in 2 different ways. In Genesis 1, and then in case we didn't get our human anthropology correct from a faith perspective, the story is told again in Genesis chapter 2 before the fall in the 3rd chapter. There's so much insight about human nature, and I remember my husband one day last year reading the first book of the Bible, Genesis, and he was so captivated, and he looked at me at one point and said, wow, human nature really hasn't changed since our creation. So what does it mean to be made in God's image and likeness? Well, you may have heard this phrase often said that God is love. Well, if God is love and I'm made in his image and likeness, that means that I too am created for love, that I'm made to love. And so this is where the dignity of the human person enters in. We're created in his image and likeness, and this means this likeness, this orientation toward love requires 2 components. It requires intellect and free will. It requires our ability to know something, to come to understand it, and then to freely choose it. You see, this is what sets us apart from the animals. This is why we're called rational animals. You see, there's more to us than living on a sensory level. There's more to us than the base reactions of, for example, when it's hot, our bodies naturally kick into sweating. When we need to eat, a little bit of dopamine in the brain is released to remind us that when we eat, it makes us feel good. It's pleasurable. But there's so much more because we're not just living on that level of base desires and reactions and instincts. We have the ability to go beyond those instincts. In fact, it's kind of neat because if you were to study the brain, the prefrontal cortex, that is the part of the brain that has to do with intellect, what has to do with reason, is in the front. It's almost as if you could take your fist and here's the brain and there's that feeling dimension of the brain, but right in the front of the brain, like a cap over the top of that kind of sensory relation that we have to the animals, is the intellect that shows that we have the ability to love. We have the ability to know something, and that we can be trained to teach our body, to teach our mind right from wrong and implement it within our body. The second component, besides being made in God's image and likeness, that's so important here, is that we're created as male and female. And just to quote briefly from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and we'll dive into this again in a second, I want you to understand that this complementarity, these differences of the male and female component, are something that the Church takes very seriously. In fact, in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, in relation to the conversation about being created as male and female, we read, I'm paraphrasing slightly, that this affects all aspects of the human person in the unity of his body and soul. It especially concerns the capacity to love and to procreate, and forming bonds of communion with others. You see how we relate to each other, not just on a sexual complementary level, but also on the complementary lifestyle of friendships, actually is impacted by the fact that we're male and female. And it's something we can't ignore, all the way down to the level of the soul. We recognize in the Church that there's a difference between man and woman. So let's dive into this male and female dimension a little bit more. I mentioned this quote earlier. A woman wants to love so she can show love. A man wants to love, sorry, let me rephrase that. A woman wants to love so she can show love. A man wants to love so he can be loved. Very different starting places for us to see in these two elements. In fact, it's interesting to me because a woman wants to experience being loved first, and then she's able to go outside of herself to love another. A man wants to love another person so that he can then be loved. Now, this is actually an interesting conversation because it relates to shame. Now, we'll unpack shame here because it really is quite fascinating, but there are a couple things we need to touch on first that GP2 lays out. Shame is directly connected to the desire to love and be loved. Also, it's important to understand that in summary, men often feel shame with regard to their reactions physically and mentally to others. Women more often feel shame regarding how they may allow themselves to be objectified. For example, with regard to modesty and immodesty, perhaps giving away too much too soon. Often we see on college campuses, specifically in the experience of women, a one-night stand, a hookup culture, the next morning, those women often feel a sincere sense of shame and remorse. It might have even kicked in sooner than that, and it touches her deeply on the level of her soul. So what exactly is shame? We live in a culture where the culture would love to do away with shame. And in some respects, we might agree depending on how we view shame. For example, we don't like body shame. In fact, there's sometimes this movement, especially in kind of this idea of saying that men and women aren't different, that we should be okay with nudity, that there's no big deal with nudity. We should be able to walk around freely. I don't know about you, but I'm not okay with the low-hanging fruits. Something happened at the fall, and we have to respect that as a result of the fall, human nature has been impacted by that, and therefore how we interact with others. But what is shame? St. John Paul II talks about sexual shame specifically in relation to covering sexual body parts that indicate whether or not we're male or female. Not only that, when we think about shame, it has to do with two things, both what we conceal that shouldn't be seen or heard, maybe thoughts and so forth, but also shame has to do with concealing those things that are so good they maybe shouldn't be revealed. A neat example of this is when we go to Mass. Isn't that a novel thought right now? Hopefully you've all been able to return back to church. But after communion, even before communion, if you ever notice the vessels that hold the body of our Lord Jesus Christ, the leftover communion host, the consecrated body and blood of Christ that is put in the tabernacle and taken out, it's veiled. Why is there a veil? Because we have this history within the church that we veil what is holy. And so this sense of shame isn't a shame of saying that's shameful in the sense that something's bad. It's showing a sense of reverence to people, things, body parts. In fact, we talk often about how you shouldn't give away too much too soon of who you are, the secrets of your life, your upbringing, because while things can be good, it's also important. Proverbs, the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament, talks about how we should try various relationships before we go too deeply into them, because there should be this natural sense of protecting the good within ourselves so it's not exploited by another human being. You see, shame doesn't just have to do with external factors, it also has to do with what's going on in here, because our ability to reason and freely choose things starts in the intellect, starts in our contemplation of what's happening day in and day out. You see, this is another really important dimension of shame, because shame, in a good sense, is this understanding that shame is always personal. It's something that we experience as an individual, or it's something that we experience in relation to another person. Because ultimately, remember, shame is oriented toward fostering love. Why is that, though? Shame develops out of an interior need, essentially over this ability in the culture to be objectified, or the ability to objectify. For example, go back to the beginning of Genesis. This is why, if you don't know this, I'm sure it's been discussed in the presentations. Carol Wojtyla, that is JP2, St. John Paul the Great, before he became Pope, wrote Love and Responsibility. It's this human anthropology. Then, when he was Pope, we came to understand that over the course of his years, he had delivered various lectures and ended up giving general audiences in St. Peter's Square. And these he titled Theology of the Body. And he'd give this weekly catechesis. And he showed how this human anthropology, ultimately that developed in Love and Responsibility, was ultimately a theology of who we are. And in this discussion, he goes back through Genesis, and we look to the fall. In Genesis chapter 3, what's one of the first things that happens after the fall? First of all, God is walking in the garden with Adam and Eve, and they're hiding themselves from him. Not only are they hiding themselves from him, they had such a great relationship with God that they walked freely and nakedly in the garden with him. There was this sense of there was no sense of objectification or the ability to be objectified. There was this, what we call, original sense of unity, an original sense of nakedness, this purity within the human person. But the very first thing that happens at the fall is that all of a sudden God looks at them and he's saying, "Where are you?" And they said, "We were afraid, we were uncomfortable," because they discovered they were naked. And the first thing they did was they covered up their body parts, the body parts that relate them one to another in this sexual complementarity. Not only that, God then asked them, "Well, who told you you were naked?" And Adam immediately looks at Eve and he kind of points like, "Well, this is what happened." And he starts to play the blame game. Kind of like I was saying earlier on, we tend to allow this passivity, this passive attitude affect our happiness. It's all about what we experience rather than taking responsibility and action in our lives. Remember, our study is based off of love and responsibility. You see, Adam ignored the fact that he had intellect and free will, and that this intellect and free will meant he too had a free choice, and he couldn't just blame another person for the destruction in the beginning that they experienced at the fall, the destruction of this original innocence, this original nakedness, this original unity and complementarity between man and woman that was so much easier than it is right now. There's a reason our culture struggles with divorce, contraception, abortion, just finding a date, pornography. It's because this objectification and the sense of shame is kicked in. But shame can actually help us redevelop that sense of love and responsibility for another person. And it's why a whole section of JP2's book is dedicated to the topic of shame. Yet it's it's almost cringeworthy because we think in our modern culture that shame is such a bad thing because we don't want to body shame or slut shame someone else. But you see, shame has to do with how I interact with the world as an individual, on how I interact with another person on a day-to-day basis. So let's talk about this from the perspective of shame from the individual as male and female, because it's actually really neat when we get down to it. You see, we understand that a man wants to love so that he can be loved. You see, men often feel shame with regard to their interaction, their reactions, both physically and mentally, to what a woman is, what a woman inspires, essentially. And again, we're talking about generalizations that go deep into our understanding of the human person. Maybe you might experience other things as well, but I think that these are all common things that we do indeed share from our nature, and the church has studied very deeply. You see, this desire of a man to love so that he can be loved, I think ultimately shows that there's a great risk in his ability to love another person. This struggle of a man to objectify another person can really be a blocker toward love, a block toward interaction with people of the opposite sex. And I find it fascinating because in a lot of the social science studies, specifically of men, and even if we did a biblical study of men, one of the deepest desires for a man is this need to be respected. Now, I think this is interesting in relation to a conversation about shame. The reason for that is that when a man feels a sense of shame, it has to do with how he's looking at another person. He tends to feel ashamed that someone might find out what those thoughts are for the other person, and that might diminish their respect for him in their eyes, because respect is so important. It's always so interesting. It's something that I've learned being married the last year and a half, is really how important this dimension of respect is for men. And even simple things such simply, laughing and maybe sharing a funny story about my spouse actually can deeply affect him, because respect is so important. This sense of, kind of in my eyes, getting a little chuckle out of something can sometimes make them feel like, well, there's something wrong with how I love, because it's so important to men, like the quote that's on the screen, that a man wants to love. He wants to show his love, to prove himself worthy of that love, to be respectable enough to receive that love. And so I think this is fascinating when we think about shame. So often we think, well, I'm ashamed. This is so bad. I'm bad. But actually, this sense of shame that we experience is motivating us to purify what's being stirred in our hearts so that we can interact with people of the opposite sex in a way that fosters love rather than rejecting it. Now, we read earlier that a woman wants to love, to be loved. I messed up that quote. She wants to be loved so that she can show love. And I'm going to type that in there. Wants to be, oops, this is great, be loved. It's what happens when you're looking at a screen for too many hours. So a woman wants to be loved so that she can show love. Now, this totally changes. The dynamic changes for a woman. You see, this desire in a woman, like I talked about earlier, a man's desire to be respected, one of the things that we see very often that women are asking, not just the culture, not just our spouses, not just the people we date, not just the people we're interested in, we're asking a handful of questions as women. Am I lovable? Am I beautiful? Am I being admired? These are fundamental questions that we ask because deep down inside, we tend to reduce our ability to sometimes show and interact in a proper loving way based on how we experience love, even how we love ourselves. Sometimes we can't even love ourselves because we have this sense of not being loved by others. Now, of course, I'll say for just a moment, that ultimately, ladies, it's so important that we have to understand that we love because Christ first loved us. And if we take this truly as our starting point, not just some cliche, how we engage with the world around us will be transformed. You see, in this interaction, there's a risk for us as women in particular of kind of trying too hard to be admired and loved and perceived as beautiful. We give away too much sometimes in the way we dress. In other words, we allow ourselves to be objectified, and that stymies, in some ways, the love that comes toward us. Because rather than fostering love, we foster arousal that maybe isn't what we're motivating toward. And it's interesting because I think that at the same time, one of the things we see is often we'll talk about kind of this desire to be close. I'll talk to women. It's fascinating to me where I'll be talking to a college student or having worked in the crisis pregnancy centers when girls think like, yeah, I'm not sleeping with my boyfriend. Everything's okay. We can sleep next to each other, but, not sleep together, not have sex. And I always challenge that. Why are you doing that? It's because there's a sense of wanting to be desired, wanting to be loved, wanting to be admired, even if they're not sleeping together. So often we women are willing to make compromises, and men, pay attention to this. Pay attention to the pressure you place on those you love, because we will sometimes do things that we don't even want for the sake of feeling loved. And then this helps to inspire that loving interaction with another person. You see, St. John Paul the Great, you've probably heard this discussed, talked about how women tend to over sentimentalize things and men tend to overly sexualize things. And these are our two great struggles as men and women. So for us, allowing ourselves to be objectified, giving away too much too soon out of a desire to be loved. These are challenges we too experience, but that sense of shame to maybe put on a little more clothing, that sense of shame that perhaps we went a little too far in our intimacy, is to help us be loved properly by another so that we can properly express our love in that same way toward another person. By not encouraging them, and this is one of the conversations I hate sometimes about modesty, is that people will say, well, you girls need to dress modestly so that you don't tempt men. There is a dimension of that. It has both to do with how we ourselves are respected and protected by others, but it also has to do with how we honor and respect and protect the way people of the opposite sex think. And I think that's really important. Again, it drives home the point that shame is ultimately about inspiring love. And so we shouldn't have this fear or discomfort of shame. Shame is a part of our human nature post the fall. Shame is a part of our conscience kicking in, that interior dialogue that's moving us and trying to stimulate us to drive ourselves forward to make the changes we need to be the men and women that we're called to be. And I'll say this, a really neat dimension of shame, and St. John Paul the Great talks about this. Well, if there's a sexualization that a man experiences toward a woman, and there's this sentimentality that a woman creates toward men, an example of sentimentality would be, this desire to feel loved, this quick emphasis on marriage and family. Boys, don't run away when women start talking about children and marriage, maybe sooner than you're ready. It's because it's a fundamental part of them romanticizing the relationship that is good. It's meant to orient them toward the gift of self. But again, sometimes it can be jumped into too soon, and so they give away too much too soon. But both this sexuality and sentimentality are good things. In fact, JP2 talks about the beauty of marriage and love and responsibility. And he talks about how shame is ultimately the shame of these sexual differences and how we interact to each other. They're ultimately swallowed up by love. He said they're dissolved in it, so that man and woman are no longer ashamed to be sharing their experiences of sexual value, because where we place greater value is okay. but it's only okay and it's best within a loving relationship that brings temperance into the interaction, that brings humility, that brings generosity, that brings tenderness and gentleness. All of these you might recognize, and this is always the homework I like to give, are virtues. They're gifts and fruits of the Holy Spirit. And often I think because we're not praying for these various gifts and virtues, we're not necessarily attaining them and fostering love as well as we could. I think it's incredible because this shows the complementarity between men and women in a very profound way. It's almost a scientific complementarity between the sexes that, in the right context, oriented toward marriage and ultimately in marriage, can build an incredibly fruitful relationship. So, on another dimension of the male and female, I want to talk about how human development and motherhood and fatherhood are actually a part of the development of our character. I mentioned at the beginning of this talk about how ultimately this has to do with happiness and a life of action, right? Living our lives well. Well, it's interesting because JP2's Carol Votil in Love and Responsibility talks about how motherhood and fatherhood are fundamental to who we are, even if we don't have children. Now, this is kind of like mind-blowing because you're not just called to a biological motherhood and fatherhood. You're called to first start with that spiritual maternity and paternity. What do I mean by this? Ultimately, JP2 talks about how essentially we're called to orient toward having this sense of responsibility for other people, this sense of love for others, but that we're fostering and developing ultimately the souls of other human beings. That I even think of the great saint, Saint Edith Stein, also known as Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. She died at Auschwitz during World War II. She was a Jewish convert that went from being a Jew to an agnostic to becoming Catholic, and ultimately a Catholic nun. She was a great philosopher, but she talks about how the female is meant to be a place, a woman is meant to be a place where other souls can unfold. That the female soul is meant to be a place, a shelter where other souls develop. Now, it's not just talking about the biological reality of our bodies as women, but it's ultimately getting at the spiritual dimension of motherhood and fatherhood, that we are called to foster and develop in others this sense of knowledge of God, of goodness, of faith. I'll never forget when I was in college, maybe 19 years old, my spiritual director at the time asked me a question at one point when I was discerning various job opportunities while in college. And he said, "Well, Timmerie, where are your children?" And I said, "Father, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm 19, not married, don't have kids, if you don't know." And he's like, "No, where are your children? Where are you giving yourself in spiritual motherhood?" You see, St. John Paul the Great talks about how motherhood and fatherhood are orienting us toward this sense of gift of self. In fact, it's fascinating because he talks about how sometimes within marriage, a woman's desire within marriage can be even greater for a child than for her husband. That's not anything we're seeing in the culture right now, is it? Think about it. We're hearing countless stories of women in their 30s and 40s who haven't married, who are not in long-standing monogamous relationships, and essentially they're frustrated and they're choosing to kind of strike out on their own and have a child through means we could talk about that are contrary to our faith, such as in vitro fertilization, or even just the fact that we're denying a child the right to its father. These are fundamental things that are problems. But again, without diving down those other paths of conversation, ultimately it's because motherhood, no matter what's happening in a culture, is fundamental to who we are. Secular or religious, it's written on our human hearts, even more so in women because of our biological anatomy. our biological chemistry, and how we are created with the ability to foster and carry children. You see, motherhood affects us even more so as women than it does as men, and because of these capabilities to carry and nurture a child. But it also affects fatherhood. It affects men who aren't married. And I know you might be thinking, okay, I'm not ready for marriage. I'm not ready for this. No, you are. This is a part of your human development to start with this spiritual maturation, as JP2 talks about, this development of the character. It gives a quote, a certain fullness which the person wishes to share with others. Seeking out others, and what he talks about are ultimately spiritual children, often people a little bit younger than us. And he says we do this as a way of transmission of our own personality. And how men often, when they have this desire for children, it's to create another similar to ourselves, to create someone in your image, in your likeness, imitating after God the Father, our ultimate creator, who created in his image and in his likeness. And again, I'll emphasize this for both men and women to understand. It is so easy for women to desire a child more than a date, more than a spouse, because we long so deeply to give ourselves in this way, to receive that unconditional love from a child. In fact, I would argue that many in our culture, because they've not experienced unconditional love, whether in their upbringing, whether in their dating relationships, they're looking for it also not just through their desire to have a child, but they're looking to receive that unconditional love from a baby who can do nothing but give unconditional love. And that teaches the mother, if you think about it, to then desire to show her love, as we talked about in that quote earlier at the beginning, how a man desires to be loved, desires to love so that he can be loved, that he desires to go outside of himself to receive within himself, that a woman desires to receive within herself to go outside of herself. This is why for some women they think, man, having a baby without a man is easier, because that baby has such a distinct element of unconditional love. Even with a sense of responsibility that you take on, that child cares for the mother, wants the mother, cries for the mother, can only be comforted by the mother. It's a very beautiful reality written into the body, yet we live in a culture that has vetted nature against itself. This contraceptive culture that rejects motherhood, that also leads men to this deeper objectification of women and a lack of responsibility in their own paternity. You see, there's a reason that there is a natural sense of shame with regard to contraception in the culture. We don't like to talk about it, but it opens a door for a greater conversation that can and should be had, just perhaps not today. So ultimately, what are we getting at? Well, if we were to go from Love and Responsibility and dive into St. John Paul the Great's theology of the body, the theology of the body is this: you are called to be a gift of self. You are made for life-giving, self-giving love. I want you to remember that and never forget. And I put the crucifix there because we receive the model and example of life-giving, self-giving love, both virginally and on the cross. And if you look at that crucifix, if you really do take it seriously, it's bloody, it's bruised, and it's beaten. That is living a gift of self. It's not easy. We're going to be hurt at times. I think about C.S. Lewis, and he has this dialogue where he talks about men, human beings without hearts, and how if we don't go outside of ourselves, if we don't allow ourselves to love and be loved, which also means being hurt, and at times maybe even hurting a little bit, unfortunately, if we don't allow ourselves to be hurt, we're going to become human beings that are heartless, with ultimately hearts that are encapsulated in our own coffins. And he talks about how we essentially create our own living hell and misery because we're social beings, and we're called to this life-giving, self-giving love that Jesus Christ has modeled for us on the cross, that we can begin in spiritual motherhood and spiritual fatherhood that will one day prepare the way, if we are called to it, to biological motherhood and fatherhood, or to continuing on that path with so many of you who I know are going to become religious sisters and priests through ongoing spiritual motherhood and fatherhood. And so I want to end with something that was written in the church's documents right around Vatican II. One of the documents that came out of Vatican II was a document called Gaudium et Spes. And when it talks about the creation of man being made in the image and likeness of God, it emphasizes this, that because we were made in God's image and likeness, this likeness reveals that the human person is the only creature on earth which God willed for itself, and that the human person can only find itself, come to a deeper understanding of self through a sincere gift of self. And so the only way we will achieve and find happiness is understanding we're created as male and female. We have this sense of freedom that directs us toward others, and that it's only if we choose to make ourselves that gift to others that we will see our lives transformed for the greater good, with ultimately that goal being heaven, with a perfect model of Jesus Christ on the cross. I thank you all for your time, and I really look forward to your questions during our time together. I'll be here as long as you want, and if you have more questions afterward, please feel free to subscribe to my podcast and radio show. It's on your favorite podcasting apps. And if you have a question, we'll take it up on my show Trending. We love to have these conversations about difficult issues that you're grappling with. So let's dive into the questions now.
Hello, Timmerie. That was awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, let's get into these questions. So you're able, anyone who's on can go on the Q&A and add a question, but we already have some flowing in. So suppose that someone, a conservative Catholic, made a post that a man is a man and a woman is a woman. This post directly opposes transgender ideology in a factual manner. And then let's say someone who supports transgender ideology made a comment. How should the Catholic reply in a charitable manner? What should he or she reply, or what should they say?
I'm reading the question real quick. So to summarize the question, I'll just summarize it because I know that's a lot to swallow. Let's say there's a social media post and someone is talking about why transgender ideology is problematic, and they give facts. They're not condemning, they're just giving factual information, right? And yet someone who supports transgenderism makes a comment. The question is, what's the adequate response for a Catholic reply that's charitable? I have to argue here, first and foremost, that if the original social media post really did lay out a good and clear breakdown of the factual information about male and female or transgenderism, that you don't have to continue to push your point home. You don't necessarily have to respond to that comment that is supporting a gender ideology. We're called to plant seeds. We're called to win people, not necessarily arguments. And that can be hard even for me. I'm a competitive person. But I also think it's helpful to prayerfully invoke the Holy Spirit. What am I called to respond in this moment? Am I called to speak up? Am I called to shut up? Am I called to sit down? What am I called to do? And if you've laid out your argument well, prudentially decide whether or not to respond. I hope that helps.
Oh yeah, completely. Because especially if the person it needs to be first and foremost above being a means to an end just to win an argument or a debate, or that makes sense. All right, the second one is just about envy. They're reading a post about someone who graduated at the top of their class, and she was their high school friend. But how would she resist this temptation of envy? Because we know comparison, it can be so detrimental to friendships or loving people authentically.
This is so hard. I'll just kind of relate it this way as well. Envy can be so hard. I think especially for women, not just women, but especially for women, this level of comparison on beauty, body image, accomplishments, everything. We live in a culture of productivity rather than allowing for us to be ourselves, There's a lot of pressure. And I can tell you something that really helps me is something that the incredible priest, Father Robert Spitzer of the Magis Center, encourages people to pray each day. There are 3 things he says to do. I'll name the first 2, but it's the third I want to focus on. He says, make the prayer that you're going to make Christ the center of your life today. Second, make the prayer that you're going to see the good news in others rather than the bad news. And I would argue that sometimes that good news in others means allowing us to say good for you, not sarcastically, and then move on. But third, to live a contributive purpose rather than a comparative purpose. And this is hard. And I have to tell you, it means I too have to get off of this thing, because I get so wrapped up in someone else who's getting married, someone else who's having a child, someone else who's doing this project and that project and taking a vacation. And so we have to remember that we have to have humility. We have to distance ourselves from temptations, and we need to focus on how am I contributing to who I am and what's going on in the lives of people around me, and stop looking out for my sense of self-esteem, essentially.
Yeah, that's huge. I love that. Comparison versus contribution.
Yeah.
And which one do you choose? All right. So I just realized this is a question. I just realized that one common ground that we have with feminists is that they also see the concept of objectification as immoral. Why do you think that the same feminists see nothing wrong with pornography or some sins if it's pretty clear that some sort of objectification is present? Did they prioritize liberty over objectification, or did I miss something? So that's a good question.
Yeah. So this concept of objectification is immoral. It's something that we share pretty much universally. I'm reading this book right now, and it's written by self-proclaimed feminist Bonnie. I'm forgetting her last name, but Bonnie something. It's called Beyond the Birds and the Bees, and it's trying to find this sexual ethics for children and pushing forward this sense of equality. And a lot of what she has to say we agree with. We agree that body shaming others isn't good, slut shaming others isn't good. This lack of self-esteem in the culture is a problem. But they encourage this sense of the only way to get past this kind of shame, to get past this kind of issue in the culture of objectification, is to kind of be all okay with nudity. And to have nudity be at the forefront of the culture. And as long as a person consents to that nudity, then everything's okay. As long as everything's consensual. And it's interesting because the moral ethic of a sexual culture really surrounds consent rather than an understanding of chastity, the value of the body, the value of modesty of speech. Because remember, modesty isn't just how we dress. And so I think these are some of the dimensions where they go wrong, is because they don't have the virtues and the deeper purpose. They just think, well, let's say the body's good, and so let's flaunt it. In the book, she gives the example of a utopia of the Dutch culture that's a little more okay with nudity. And it's interesting because that might be cultural, but it's also doesn't find kind of compatibility with the fallen human nature that objectifies and can be objectified.
Yeah, I've never thought about that with the consent piece, because it's still not responsible to use someone even if they consent to you using them. So yeah, that's completely what JP2 is talking about in Love and Responsibility, the responsibility we have not to use even if someone consents to that.
And what are we consenting to? I think that's the whole problem. We don't even have an understanding of what we're consenting to, so it's a problem.
Awesome. Okay. This next one, does physical beauty or lust have any place in a loving, virtuous relationship, or should it be purely an intellectual, altruistic love towards another, regardless of physical attraction?
Adam, you are orienting yourself in a right direction, but the love of beauty, there's nothing wrong. Of course, lust is wrong if we're objectifying someone. And I'll give you an example. I'm not going to get into the bikini debate today. That's a whole nother conversation. But or I could even say a beautiful ad of, I'll go get rid of the bikini debate. Now someone's going to ask it. Let's say there's an image of a woman a little more scantily clad. The best thing as a man to do would, okay, you're exposed to it. Yes, she is beautiful, but move on. Lust would be where you now start to indulge in that image. You now start to engage with that image in your mind, and it starts to direct you toward a certain type of behavior with that person. And so that's where lust is a problem, not beauty. Beauty's a good thing. We shouldn't be ashamed of the fact that you find a woman beautiful. That's good. It's that you have to respect her and take on a sense of responsibility for her.
Yeah, because even in the question, Timmerie, does physical beauty or lust, but they don't equate one another.
Yeah.
The lust is the shortcut or the temptation to get like the crumbs, but the beauty is something created by God. Yeah. All right. Let's see. Will this beautiful visual PowerPoint be shared on Facebook? We can do that. Yes, we'll make sure that it is afterwards. What's wrong with using contraception just to space out children as opposed to avoid them altogether?
Great question, Guillermo. So contraception is important to understand. It's an important conversation. I'll come first from a health perspective. Contraception is a group 1 carcinogen made up of synthetic forms of estrogen and progesterone that are detrimental for a woman's body. It's a cancer-causing agent. It contributes to blood clotting, anxiety, and depression. I could go on with a number of things having to do with contraception. Let me tell you, I've worked in the crisis pregnancy center. So many of our women were on contraception and they had a lot of side effects. And if you have conversations with friends and family, a contracepting woman just isn't herself. She's a fake version of herself. I'm not saying she's acting fake. I'm saying her body's being manipulated. So that's on one dimension because we care about the health of women, and that's important. On the second dimension, most hormonal contraceptives, if not all of them, function both as a contraceptive and an abortifacient. So there's one thing where we prevent sperm and egg from ever meeting, right? But there's another thing when sperm and egg meet and that baby who's over here just outside of the ovary in the fallopian tube, that new distinct human life has already been created, and that baby on one of the sides of the fallopian tube needs to travel down the fallopian tube and be implanted in the woman's uterus. What contraception can do is it can also work as an abortifacient. That is killing the new human life. And I know it's hard to think about in its earliest stages, ending that human life through altering the chemical balance in the body, because new life is fragile and it needs the right chemical components of progesterone and so forth to support the life. It can also cause the mucuses, and I know gross, sorry, but to be different than they ought so that the baby can't travel to implant in the uterus, among other things. It's like dropping a bomb on that baby and saying that there's not only is no new life welcome here, but any new life that does enter this house will most likely end. That's how contraception functions. But a lot of people don't realize that it can both prevent new life from starting and end a new life in its earliest stages that have already developed. So fundamentally, that's what's wrong about contraception, but it can also feed this attitude where we reduce the other person to an object of use. And so this is a long answer, and I mean, this is a whole talk summarized, but the church says that there are 2 dimensions to every sexual act, the unitive and the procreative dimension. So every sexual act should unite the 2 persons together for the good of the spouses, for the pleasure, for the joy, the unity. But it should also be procreative. That means that it should be open to new life. Now you see, if one of those dimensions is damaged, the other doesn't fully develop. So if we're not open to new life, we can objectify and not fully unify with our spouse. Versus if we are not uniting to our spouse, there can be a damage done to the child. For example, sex outside of marriage, who suffers? The baby that's conceived outside of marriage. So I mean, there's a lot we could say here, but we need those 2 dimensions of union and the complementarity and openness to life. I hope that helps.
Oh, that was fantastic, Timmerie. Yeah, we know so many women with osteoporosis, all these different things that are happening, but a lot of women don't talk about it,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Might I just make a comment? one last comment. I myself have, I'll share this in this context, polycystic ovarian syndrome, which relates to issues with fertility, and I could go on and on. But a common band-aid for polycystic ovarian syndrome is contraception. I've been recommended contraception multiple times since I was in high school, but it's a band-aid. It doesn't address the issue. And see, serious issues can arise from polycystic ovarian syndrome: anxiety, depression, pain, a tremendous amount of pain, prevention of being able to conceive children. If I just took contraception long term, it could damage my ability to have children and damage my day to day as well.
Yeah, thank you for that vulnerability, Timmerie. Yeah, because I know a lot of women who are watching. Thank you. As a woman, what are signs to look for from a man which tells us that we should stop trying to desire love from him and move on?
This is a great question. And I would love to get your thoughts on this one. If he's just not into you, if he's just not responding, I'll say this. Men are simple, and I'm not kind of reducing you guys, but they're simple. If they're interested, you're going to know. Now, yes, we live in a culture where men maybe aren't being as forward as they used to be. They're maybe not initiating as much as they used to be. And so if you really do care for someone and you're really not sure, I don't think it's wrong to ask at a certain point. If something's being drug on, you're hanging out, to have that define the relationship talk, the DTR. I think that these are important things to just do in the climate we live in.
Yeah, definitely a lack of pursuit. I agree with you. Yes. All right. Do you think that the book could have just as well been titled Freedom and Responsibility? If yes, why?
Yes, absolutely. Freedom and responsibility. I think we're more attracted to love and responsibility, but because we don't know what freedom means. And I mean, even our American understanding of freedom is confusing. We think that freedom is to do whatever we want, but freedom is ultimately oriented toward choosing the good. It's to do something, not to avoid something. That's what freedom's for. So again, if we put freedom and responsibility, we'd be confused by what it meant, especially as Americans, but this isn't just written for Americans.
Right. To do what we ought to do, not just what we can do. All right. How does prenuptial agreements factor in JP2's perspective on love?
The church's perspective on love. Prenuptial agreement could mean that you're already trying to get out of something before you even started it, and it could be grounds to say that the marriage might not be valid because you weren't looking at staying committed to each other. So prenuptial agreement violates, and I know you guys have been through this, so I didn't cover it today, but parts of the marital vow to be free, total, faithful, and fruitful. You see, that totality is violated by a prenuptial agreement. That idea of fidelity, also known as permanence, is violated by a prenuptial agreement, because you're saying this could expire. And so it's a real problem, because it means there's not this total gift of self occurring both before marriage is entered into and then while it's being entered into.
Awesome. All right. Where is the life of celibacy fitting into the picture? So everything that we're talking about, where is that celibate life? How does that fit in?
That's a great question. Well, I think it's important to remember that just because you're a priest, just because you're choosing to be a celibate life, just because you're a religious sister, or because you're single, doesn't mean that you don't have sexual desires. And so shame is still real, no matter what state of life we're in. Shame is a reality of the fact of how we relate to the opposite sex. And so that's how shame enters into the picture. Spiritual motherhood, I hope that it was clear that I was talking about not just biological motherhood and fatherhood. That's why we call priests father. Why it would be great if this past Father's Day you wished your priest a happy Father's Day as well. And so celibacy, this conversation isn't just for single, dating, or married people. It's for all of us to understand our human development and interaction with others.
Yeah, that even connects like to the seminary, right? Like that a man is giving his semen, like he's letting the seed die for more and more children. So Yeah, it's pretty amazing, our church and the connection with all of this. Why is contraception wrong for non-Catholics?
Well, I think we answered this. I
Yeah.
mentioned, and I'll just summarize it very briefly. The physical harms to the woman's body, not just cancer, not just blood clots, not just anxiety. We could go on. Second, whether you're Catholic or not, contraception can be a participation in an abortion, functioning as an abortifacient. And then third, it can lead to an objectification of the man and woman of one another. You don't have to be in a religious context to explain or have this conversation. I've had it with the girls in the crisis pregnancy centers and in front of the abortion clinics who have no faith at all, and they get this. They really do.
Yeah, and that's what I love about Love and Responsibility, Timmerie. It's about the human person and the dignity. It's not just the Catholic human person, it's the dignity of the human person, right? So everyone understands the humanity that we carry. How should a teenage couple, 18 years old, so these are babies, approach marriage and their roles? A teenage couple.
Well, how should a teenage couple, 18 years old, approach marriage and their roles? This is a great question. And if you're dating, I think it's awesome that you're already thinking about marriage, because we shouldn't be in the dating game if we're not thinking about marriage as that goal we talked about earlier. You've got to have kind of that target that you're making your mark on. I think that marriage and our roles, we have to understand that, especially if you're 18, unless you're planning on getting married soon, your journey of dating is going to be longer. And so the challenges that chastity brings, the challenges that shame brings, you've got to listen to shame as it's kicking in. You've got to listen as you're worried, you know what, that situation might not be the best for us to be in, because it can just be tempting if you're fearful or uncomfortable ahead of time. It's important because dating for a long period of time, although it can be a great gift and allow for a lot of change and shaping each other, it can also be really challenging. And so you have to pray for the virtue of chastity, and you also have to work on practicing it and applying it. You know, rules for, like, okay, I remember my husband and I, like, when we were in college, we didn't hang out past like 10 o'clock. And I know that's crazy for college students to think, but it was a rule. But I remember friends coming up to my husband saying that they were really struggling with premarital sex or just chastity in general. And his first response was always, well, how late do you hang out? Are you always hanging out alone? And they're like, oh, well, you know, we're out alone until 3 o'clock in the morning. There are situations that we know are kind of feeding the struggles that we might have.
Right. So boundaries. Yeah. How do you avoid objectifying even within a marriage and continue to cultivate love and respect instead? That's a great question. I don't think we talk enough about within a marriage that you can still objectify one another.
Yes. Chastity belongs within marriage as well. That's not something people are always like, what, I'm supposed to be chaste when I'm married? Yeah, you are. No extramarital affairs, no pornography, no contraception, no abortion. These are all important dimensions. I think that what's important with regard to objectification within marriage and cultivating love is really understanding that respect for the other person, learning to respect the other person, their dreams, their desires, the favorite things. If we start to listen, if we come from the perspective of trying to understand the other person first, it's going to protect us from objectifying. So ultimately come back, am I taking responsibility for understanding who you are, rather than reducing you to what you are in a compilation of body parts? And women can do this too with regard to how I emotionally feel good when you're around. And we sometimes as women want our men to make us feel good, but that's not their responsibility. Our happiness is not contingent upon how they make us feel.
Yeah, that is wonderful. And just, I really think that how we act in marriage, I'm not married, but as you act in marriage is how you acted before marriage. So like being a chaste man or woman, it's going to be a lot easier to be chaste in marriage, you know? So yeah. All right, when it comes to love, if one is in a chase dating relationship and the man is expressing he does not feel love but friendship, likely due to experiencing love physically in the past, what is the best way to respond about how love between man and woman should be cultivated? Okay, so Timmerie, does that make sense? Like, it
Yeah.
seems like they're in a relationship, but the man's not feeling loved because he was physically loved before. And so, yeah.
I will be really frank and argue. I wouldn't necessarily buy that he doesn't feel love because he's experienced sexual intimacy in the past. If he is saying that, he's manipulating you and it's time to go. I'm going to be honest there. If that's what he's saying is the reason for why he doesn't feel loved. I mentioned during the talk, and it would be so fun to unpack this more, but what's really important, one of the things that's really important for men is to feel respected. It's this culture of honor, this culture of responsibility. And so often when a man does not feel loved, if he's not feeling loved, it's because he does not feel respected by you. And so perhaps there's something going on in how the two of you interact that's making him feel less respected. And I would also argue if he's saying he doesn't feel loved, ask him why. What am I doing? Give me some examples and tell him I'm not going to get mad. I just need to hear why. And if you really do think it's because he's experienced sexual intimacy in the past, ask him if you think that's why, but give him a chance in the other ways first.
Yeah, it brings me back to Father Matt's talk when he was saying that we objectify others. We actually see ourselves as tools to be used.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be something that he needs to work through too, because it's reflecting from his past on who he believes he is. So it seems like more of an identity issue, you know?
Right. And
Yeah.
sometimes you can go really deep into his childhood as well, and there might be more going on.
All right, how do we support our loved ones and show them love despite disagreeing with their choice to marry a same-sex partner?
Great question. Hard answer, but I think that it's livable. And I'll say I'm not just coming at this from the perspective of, hey, this is the ideal. I too have friends, multiple family members who experience same-sex attraction and are choosing to live certain lifestyles, right? A gay lifestyle. Always remember, gay isn't an identity, it's a lifestyle. And you can have same-sex attraction, not choose to act upon it. The answer to the question is this: we can't participate in their weddings, we can't encourage their weddings, we can't celebrate their weddings. Can we spend time with people? Yes. There's a huge difference between participating and supporting and loving a person. You can still love the person and not attend and participate this. Whether they're same-sex attracted, maybe Catholics getting outside of the church, maybe it's just a really horrible relationship and you shouldn't be supporting it. We shouldn't be supporting what is ultimately a lie of the body and isn't a true path of happiness. As hard as that is, you may or may not be called to have those conversations with your friends or loved ones. But what I do say is if you have the ability to still continue to have a relationship, having that relationship will open up a future opportunity to have those difficult conversations as they arise.
All right. Is it okay to treat your boyfriend or girlfriend as a baby? Does it play a role of how we want to love and be loved?
What, can you repeat that again?
Sure. Is it okay to treat your boyfriend or girlfriend as a baby? Does it play a role on how we want to love and be loved?
So to kind of ridicule them is what I'm taking from that, if you are, or
maybe mothering. Maybe that's what they're saying.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, but it is the 18, like it's a younger couple it's saying.
Okay. I don't see the question, so I can't visualize it as well. Is it okay to, treat a loved one? I think there's a real problem if we're like trying to mother, like Jen said, or father another person. I'm guessing this is coming from a girl, my guess, the question. I'm gonna get myself in trouble for that one.
No, you're right. It is.
But kind of this attitude at times to maybe overly mother, to maybe be the savior, to kind of what I think Kristalina Everett and Jason Everett in their work talk about missionary dating, and how missionary dating is problematic if we're trying to fix the other person, because it's more so that we're trying to like feel needed rather than trying to love. So if you're missionary dating, if you're feeling like you're babying the person, maybe you should just be a friend and encourage them to get the help they need rather than be in a relationship with them.
Yeah. I've heard it that way too, Timmerie, evangel dating. Like where you're evangelizing them and that's why you're dating them. It's not going to be evenly yoked, you know?
Yep.
So, yeah.
Respect for them.
Yes. Okay, so why and in what aspects, this is from a man, why and in what aspects are men needed in our society, particularly towards women? Why are men needed? What aspects?
Men are so needed, despite what our culture has to say. We need you to be you. We need you to be bold. We need you to be leaders. And when I say leaders, it's not by running at the front of the pack and leading everything. It's leading by your character. It's being responsible with how you interact, by being willing to have these tough conversations and to uphold standards, by being protectors, by nurturing that innate desire to protect. And to lead with strength. And when I say strength, I'm not just talking physical strength, I'm talking spiritual strength. We need you to be the men you're created to be. And I have to say, I have this recommendation. There's a book that came out this year. It's called Consecration to Saint Joseph. It was written by Father Calloway. You want to talk about masculinity in the culture? It's a 33-day consecration to Saint Joseph. Whether you do the consecration or not is up to you, but the book dives very deeply into understanding masculinity and understanding why Saint Joseph is actually a great model that's relatable for understanding masculinity. So I highly recommend this as a way to help you better understand your role in society and find good mentors and men you look up to. Talk to them, ask them questions.
Yeah, we need community men too. We need men that are going to protect and foster life, and that they're also, just like Saint Joseph, he was the terror of demons, but he protected Mary's purity, and there's something so beautiful about that. And yeah, I had wonderful men, fathers and grandfathers, and I think it's just amazing that the prophetic can thrive under that covering of protection and sacrifice.
Yes.
So how about the transgender community? They have sexual desires too. So what should they do?
I think that's a good starting point to understand that, we're all human. We all have sexual desires. That's important to understand. What should they do? Well, whether you are same-sex attracted, whether you're heterosexually attracted, whether or not you're experiencing gender identity issues, all of us are called to chastity. Chastity is a universal call for each and every single one of us. Why would we teach anyone differently? Is that hard because they can't have male and female marriage? Yes, but male and female is what marriage is. And just because of a court case in 2016 redefining marriage in the United States and in other countries in similar ways doesn't change the fact of what marriage is or what every human person is called to in chastity. And chastity is this, for those who maybe don't quite have an understanding. It's faithfulness to your vocation, whether you're single, whether you're married, whether you're a priest, or whether you're a religious sister. So if I'm single, I'm not supposed to be engaging with anyone of the same or opposite sex because that's not my vocation. If I'm married, remember, marriage is only between one man and one woman. I could define that, but I'm not right now. Between one man and one woman, that means no extramarital affairs. That means no pornography. That means no spiritual, emotional kind of relationships and cheating with other people, even if they're not sexually intimate. We're all called to chastity. Same thing with our priests and religious sisters. They're called to being faithful to the vocation and vow they have chosen, even with they too expressing and experiencing sexual desires.
Yeah, I think you nailed that. All right, 2 more. So isn't there a bad shame where someone has wrongly pushed their shame on you from a distorted place of untruth. For example, you need to be abandoned or healed from this false shame, such as sex is bad, or almost like our sexuality is something that's not good. So is there a bad shame, or this is what that person's getting at?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. There's a lot. I mean, I think the conversation of sex is bad is maybe something some of us have heard from our parents, or from maybe within the context of the church when people are uncomfortable or don't know how to explain things. So we do have to be careful, because this is where our intellect comes into play. We need to study and know and understand our faith and know truth, because we need to be able to spot when someone is telling an untruth, when someone is projecting their own sense of shame and past experiences on us. And that can be really hard, especially if it's loved ones or friends. So I challenge you to really discern and keep things in prayer while still listening to what other people have to share with you.
Awesome. And then this is about married couples, where it's back to the children. Can married couple feel that they've had enough children during the course of marriage? And if so, is abstinence suggested? What other ways or means can you suggest that can be used in spacing your children instead of contraception?
Great question. And I'm going to mention, before I dive into this, actually, one of the quotes that I had forgotten from Love and Responsibility that I was reading this morning. And GP2 talks about how it's okay to not desire a child. You don't have to desire a child, but you have to accept a child. So I just want to preface that with that, because I know a lot of people are scared of having children or scared of having another child. It would be challenging, but we're always open to the new life that comes our way. That being said, it is acceptable. Humana Vitae, that was a document written at the end of the 1960s by Pope Paul VI. Humana Vitae has to do with human life, human love, and responsible parenthood, and it discusses this question. And it needs to be for a serious reason. And ultimately, the husband and wife are responsible before God, for their decision to abstain from sexual intimacy during the fertile period of a woman's cycle, as to avoid conceiving more children. It has to be for a serious and legitimate reason. This is where, I'm sorry, the apartment above me, they're being loud. This is where the responsibility of loving your spouse, true respect and understanding for one another, is so important. And I think that it's important to understand inviting in a spiritual director, continuing to have these conversations together, and really take it to prayer, because the choice to abstain from sexual intimacy is challenging. Although we do have naturally fertile and naturally infertile times in our body God created, the use of NFP can be utilized. But again, that responsibility does lie on you. Perhaps you were called to be open to life and you just weren't feeling there. You're culpable before God. And so again, we don't need contraception. There's that natural respect for the body that can occur. But again, it is very prayerful, and it's between you and your spouse.
Yeah. Okay, last one. I'm going to put some questions together. But what are some books you recommend on true womanhood? And then the difference, if you can speak a little bit, femininity versus feminism, and how does that look? And then somebody asked, the same thing, the aspects of a woman that are needed in our society. Same person who asked about the men. So we'll just mesh all that together for womanhood for our last question.
Okay, it's a few questions, so tell me if I missed something. I'll hit on femininity versus feminism. Feminism, big picture, would be great. An ideology of respect for women and upholding the value of women in society. That would be great. That's not what it's turned into in our culture. It's turned into saying that there's no differences between men and women. It's turned into saying that men and women are not just equal. It says that men and women are the same, no differences. It teaches that contraception is necessary for me as a woman to have a family, to have a career, to have an education. Feminism distorts the woman, versus femininity is ultimately respecting the woman. It's understanding that motherhood is a part of who we are, not necessarily that all of us will have children, but it is written into our biochemical makeup. That fertility isn't that pregnancy isn't a disease to be fought after like a cancer. These are fundamental elements because there's been this distortion of who we are as women because of a contraceptive culture. And it really, I would say, has reduced us to becoming a cog in a machine. And femininity says, no, I'm creating God's image and likeness. I'm created for love. And that's going to be my starting point and end point for understanding who I am and how I interact with other people. As for the other questions, what aspects are needed in our society for women specifically? This is a really great question, and I would recommend, with regard to the readings, books such as Mulieris Dignitatem, which is right here. It's short. I'm going to show you. It's on the dignity and vocation of women in the English translation. It's an easy read from JP2. He had a lot to say about women. There's a great work by, I'm forgetting her name. This is why it's great to be next to my bookcase right now. Sorry. There's a book, 2 books I highly recommend, more from social scientists. They're by Shanti Feldhahn, For Women Only and For Men Only. I think it's backward. But the books essentially help you understand the inner workings of men and the inner workings of women and how to understand them. I think those are great examples. If you want to break down love and responsibility, Ed Suri has a great book called Men, Women, and the Mystery of Love. That is a more accessible version of breaking down love and responsibility, like we've been doing in this series, for those who maybe are a little scared of reading Love and Responsibility, because it is a hefty, challenging book. But as for aspects of women needed in our society, understanding the gift of self is fundamental to who you are. Don't be afraid of expressing your desire, if you're single, to be married and have children. I think sometimes we're scared to say that because it makes us less than, makes us less a woman in our anti-child culture. I think that these are things that men need to hear. And be humble. Be humble, be chaste, practice the virtues, look at the 12 gifts of the the 12 fruits of the Holy Spirit and the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit, pray for them and find ways to practice them. And that applies to men and women. It'll really transform your life if you know what those are and seek after them.
Oh yeah, that's wonderful. And like even the aspect of the feminine genius that JP2 talks about, like that's something that's already innate within us, just who we are. And I think we have to be so careful with feminism that we are not reflecting a disordered man.
Amen. Yes. And I actually, on that, one other book came to mind, a book that came out last year by Dr. Carrie Gress. I actually interviewed her on the podcast, and it's called The Timmerie Exposed. Wow. And it talks about not toxic masculinity, it talks about toxic femininity. She also has a book called Theology of the Home that's really soft and gentle. It's a tabletop, beautiful book, like a magazine photos. Those are 2 really great books by Dr. Carrie Gress that touches very heavily on femininity.
Thanks, Timmerie. Yeah, we have a lot to read. But I think that's beautiful because true masculinity and femininity, they are not toxic. It's something so beautiful and good, and it shows God. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. You can catch Timmerie on Relevant Radio 5 days a week. And remember, next Tuesday, June 30th, Colin Nikaza from the Archdiocese of New York and Catholic NY will give us a talk on the Divine Mercy, the antidote for misery. So blessings to you all. Until next Tuesday, you're in our prayers. And remember, love responsibly.